topic, and we hope that all things work for good. And with that being said, this information will be presented through and by NPR. This information may not be the only information, and if you agree or disagree, or have any documentation that can complement what we're discussing, please do so. That please bring it to the table. That'd be great. So we'll just get into it as we go. So, a forgotten history of how the U.S. government segregated America. Why did I feel this particular article was so important? And not necessarily an article per se, but just the topic, and this article serving as the seed or the catalyst for the topic of discussion to begin. Why do I feel it's so important? Because I do work with urban core developers, that is real estate developers, investors that have a interest in revitalizing, if you will, neighborhood residential neighborhoods and commercial buildings and districts, and it's very lucrative for them. In that, I can see the benefits of that being the financial American dream being built. At the same time, without control of income as well as expenses overall for the everyday individual, and the rising prices of homes, of housing, as well as the shrinking inventory of housing. It's made it very difficult for the everyday individual that is working to be able to find sustainable rental housing as well as homes. And residential homes, real estate, commercial real estate, river parks, riverfronts, infrastructure. Um, all these things play a role in the psyche of the everyday individual as well as the growing culture of the affected area. So let's go ahead and get into it. A forgotten history of how the U.S. government segregated America. Segregation in America also plays a huge role when we're talking about, or another conversation, we're talking about public education when it comes to segregated America. I'm going to have a independent and unbiased, obviously, perspective as we're looking to create professional, peaceful dialogue for the betterment and growth of all of society uh, in every capacity. So, strong statements here. I'm also looking at a public relations perspective. Federal housing policies created after the Depression ensured that African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into the urban housing projects, such as Detroit's Brewster Douglas Towers. And we're going to get into some of these words as well, break down some of these meanings. We're going to keep going, guys. There's thoughts on that statement. I'll read that one more time. Federal housing policies created after the Depression ensured that African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects, such as Detroit Brewster Douglas Towers. So one key word that pops out to me is the depression. So we have to, if we're looking to move forward through appreciation of the past, if you will, we have to be able to know certain situations, and the depression obviously played a role in the federal housing policies for African Americans. Depression, we'll look up Federal Housing Authority and African Americans. Got to know that timeline. And other people of color were left out of new suburban communities. Another keyword, suburban communities, which is a type of environmental area or territory, and pushed instead into urban housing projects, such as Detroit's Brewster Douglas Towers. We can look into housing projects, and when you're looking into particular subjects, you always want to look at the origin, the purpose, and the function. So that'd be fun, maybe for us to get into or look for yourself of housing projects, the origin, purpose, and the function. So in 1933, faced with the housing shortage, the federal government, okay, so we already know that we have our local, state, and federal governments, and we already know that we have it's the federal government that oversees the policies for the states to operate between, and therefore the state provides policies and practices that give individual municipalities and counties um, room to operate, if that makes sense. So we're talking about the highest level, if you will, national. Let's see. So in 1933, faced with the housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing stocks. Powerful words. Author Richard Rothstein says the housing programs begun under the New Deal were tantamount to a state-sponsored system of segregation. Now, I'm trying to see if I can find my quote because I'm on this radio talk show once a month, and I have a particular quote that I read, one of my three values when I go onto this civics community relations conversation on the show. I found it. And with that being said, um, author Richard Rothstein says the housing programs begun under the New Deal. So the first thing I think about when I think of New Deal, I'm thinking about, okay, well, who was in control politically when that begun? But at the same time, if you're wise in civics and in life, it doesn't matter, what the sides are perceived traditionally in civics and diplomacy. You usually have people working both sides anyways. So therefore, you advocating for a particular side is really, it's great. But at the same time, there's so many things going on behind the scene where kind of find out, you know, what you're advocating is not even in interest of your highest good. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but it has been shown. So we have to be wise enough to know that these are possibilities. So therefore, how do we maximize our productivity with certain possibilities facing us? So therefore, I think about, okay, well, the New Deal, and I think of political parties, but then at the same time, it makes me go right back into one of my values in regards to, well, I'll say this. This is something that I speak on the radio show. Not to get off topic, but my goal is to stretch the minds of Black America and to advocate it is okay to go against the grain and step outside your comfort zone in your personal life and professional career. There's a life experience I am growing in every day, so I pray I continue to practice what I preach. So, with that being said, one of my values, especially when it comes to the New Deal, is President George Washington warned that political parties would lead to divisions and fighting among the people. This, he feared, would lead to foreign influence in the government and other forms of corruption. Despite Washington's warnings, the first two political parties in the U.S. rose from his own cabinet, and since then, parties have become prominent forces in American politics against political parties as they cause division amongst the people of the country to foreign influence. The first two political parties were the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, which were started by President Washington's cabinet members Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. And I always want to shout out the movie Hamilton. We have some that really don't advocate for it because those individuals advocate to check your facts and your rule books, which I completely understand. But for the simple fact that there's not enough engaging civics, any content for individuals such as myself or younger, I'm just great to see something that touches the modern section, a modern community, but also is advocating for civics. You know what I mean? So critical thinking, if you will. So therefore, even George Washington, his political parties in America came out of George Washington, the first, president, if you will, of America in that regard. To where basically he's saying, I brought together in my own cabinet so many um, minds that different perspective minds that I would need to really run this country. And because the minds were so perspective and diverse, there were fractions within my cabinet that created political parties. So, at any rate, when you think of the New Deal, I think who was in charge of that, political party era at that time. But at the same time, I jumped right back into one of my values of President George Washington. Warning against political parties. So it doesn't even matter what party was running that because it's still one big show. So with that being said, read that sentence again. Author Richard Rothstein says the housing programs begun under the New Deal were tantamount to state-sponsored system of segregation. I'm gonna try to go quickly and not ponder on too much, but I just wanted to give you a little insight. The government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white middle class, lower middle class families, he says. African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into the urban housing projects. Now, first of all, the government's efforts. Let's keep that in mind. There's no negative nor positive. It's information that we have to emotionally and intellectually take in, process, and output. As we have to make sure that we're helping to pave the way for the next generations to come. So the government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle class, lower middle class families. And African Americans and other people of color were left out of this new suburban community and pushed instead into the urban housing projects. I just want to touch on real quick. I had to look up this word. I kept seeing this word, suburban. Suburban. I kept seeing this word, and we'll keep going. So Rothstein's new book, The Color of Law, examines the local, state, and federal housing policies that mandated segregation. He notes that the Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, furthered the segregation effort by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who are mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. Emotional intelligence is so Emotional intelligence is so important because you can't help what information you take in, but you can, as best you can, be able to process and push what information goes out. As easier said than done, branding and representation is everything. So, with that being said, this document here, or this article is stating, or this paragraph, according to the book Color of Law, there was some segregation going on, and a policy known as redlining. Um, Basically, the government, if you will, the housing side of it, was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. One of the first things that come to my mind when I hear that is why. Like, I want to know why. Like, why? And I want to hear a real answer. Niggas say just because we felt XYZ. I can respect that because we're all adults, we're all accountable, but we have to get to the roots of things. And for a statement like that to be said, and if it is true, what was the idea you had in mind to segregate in that regard? And also, maybe, it could be have been the times, obviously. So to question the times, me to question the times now about what was going on back then is really not right for me, anyways, because it was a lot different environment, different perspectives, and shouldn't even speak on that out of honor of the past of history. But at the same time, looking at it from a analytical perspective of how do we ensure that history does not repeat itself in that regard, you want to look at why was there mass producing of entire subdivisions for whites. And I know that created jobs for one. Because now you're construction, you're building, but then also there was a requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. Rothstein says these decade old housing policies had a lasting effect on American society. Powerful sentence. The segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile when they're living in segregated neighborhoods where opportunity is absent. Opportunity is absent in segregated neighborhoods. So I have mixed emotions on that one because there's truth on both sides. Because one, it's great to have outside influence coming in to provide resources both within and without. But at the same time, it's also, I would say, the role of the inside to be able to provide those opportunities, not only for the inside, but also to complement what's outside and to compete as well as to engage with outside. Easier said than done. If we want greater equality in this society, if we want a lowering of the hostility between police and young African American men, we need to take steps to desegregate. I feel like that's an open statement, and I would love to get your thoughts on that. If we want greater equality in this society, if we want a lowering of the hostility between police and young African American men, we need to take steps to desegregate. Easier said than done. At the bare minimum, we are all, as individual adults, accountable for the highest actions of our lives, both for ourselves and those around us, to include our um, emergency response units, if you will, because those are tax dollars being paid for the constituents' protection and enjoyment. And I believe in the word it says to hold oneself blameless. So some things are beyond one's control, and those with justice, if you will be taken care of. But at the same time, for us to uphold that justice, if you will, what you, you have to be blameless. So I learned when I was in corporate America. I am a independent business development consultant and advisor now, working with the private sector, overseeing their community relations through grassroots marketing. Um, I remember a policy that was given to me in corporate America that said, Donovan, if you feel like this policy does not work, go through the procedures and do exactly what the policy's procedures are requesting. And if you do it and it shows that it does not work, then that you're putting it on the policy creators table to make the changes, because now the policy creator cannot say, oh, well, they didn't follow exactly what I said. So that's why it happened this way. But if you follow exactly what that policy creator said, and it does not happen that way, and it's proven, obviously, over time to add insult to injury, then that policy creator, if they want the best outcome, has to change their policy. But you have to first go through and complete the procedure, even if you feel like the procedure is not right or the policy is not right. So with that being said, you know, if we want a greater equality in the society, if we want lowering of the hostility between police and young African American men, we need to take steps to desegregate. I want to hear your thoughts. I'm not sure if that's a right or wrong answer. I don't know what is considered right or wrong, but at the same time, thoughts on that, as I'm always advocating, easier said than done. And of course, I want to hear your thoughts. But the mindset, at least for any individual, should be to make sure that one is walking with the highest of standards to represent where they come from, as far as their immediate family, their neighborhood and community, city, state, country, and the world. The global. Being a human being species, if you will. So here's the color of law interview highlights on how the Federal Housing Administration justified discrimination. Powerful statement. Give me your thoughts on that. On how the Federal Housing Administration justify discrimination. I would love to interview a Federal Housing Administration representative to get their thoughts. I'm not making this person a spokesperson, but for the sake of engagement, that would be really great to get deeper into this conversation. But on how the Federal Housing Administration, under the New Deal, justified discrimination, supposedly. The Federal Housing Administration's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. So let's be real and honest. It's about money. And as I get deeper into the corporate and civics world, it always boils down to money, even down to the color. It's money. And which I respect from that perspective. Bottom line is this: we're losing money because for some reason the property values uh, decline. I don't know what else to say. So then you got to look at from a African American, if you will, perspective. Do you see a decline in your current neighborhood, and or do you see your neighborhood declining? You know, let's actually touch it in more heart. The Federal Housing Administration justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, we're gonna find out what suburbs are as well, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, the property values, and therefore their loans would be at risk. So therefore, now you're getting into, especially me serving as an urban core developer. resource. Now you're getting into um, you're getting into the housing, if you will. Let's talk about that in more detail. So to support what I'm about to say, let's continue on. There was no basis for this claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. There was no basis for this claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, when African Americans tried to buy homes in all white neighborhoods or in mostly white neighborhoods, property value rose because African Americans were more willing to pay more for properties than whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. I want us all to ponder on that. I want to hear your comments if you agree or disagree to that statement. If you agree to that statement, what are some of the things that we can't change what happened in the past, but what are some of the things that we can address uh, and focus on moving forward? Because these are just some of the type of statements that people indirectly ingrain in their heart and where distrust builds. So no matter where we are and what changes we need to make, it's very important for us to one for the true change, especially for those that may feel like they're affected. You have to first throw out, and be accountable um, for what the challenge is. I'm gonna just say it like that, what the challenge is, and by recognizing that there is a challenge, that there was a challenge, and saying, "Hey, let's talk about how to move forward over time," is the way to actually make or create development. So I'm gonna read that statement one more time. There was no basis for the claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, when African Americans tried to buy homes in all white neighborhoods, were mostly white neighborhoods, property values rose because African Americans were willing to pay more for properties than whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had so fewer choices. So the rationale that the Federal Housing Administration used was never based on any kind of study. It was never based on any reality. Again, I need to know your thoughts. Do your research on what you are, this if this stuff is if this information is true, because it's going out into the public, and people that really want to be the best citizen they can be are looking to learn, and so they have to receive information. And if they just go off of this from face value, they may have a certain perspective. So if you feel like this is not true or whatnot, leave your comments, throw in some information that some links we can look at, talk about. We've already talked about maybe reaching out to a FHA representative, see if they want to do a quick interview, or something of that nature to get their thoughts. So on federal, on how federal agencies used redlining to segregate African Americans. The term redlining comes from the development by the New Deal, by the federal government, of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. And those maps were color coded by first the Homeowners Loan Corp, and then the Federal Housing Administration, and then adopted by the Veterans Administration. And these color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. And anywhere where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. And again, I like to know why. And based upon what these corporate worlds saw from these residential individuals, it gave them the sense of, hey, we're going to be losing money. So I want to know at that time, what was it being perceived or being shown that gave this corporate world decision maker, the idea that we can't do business with these individuals. And I want to know, what they saw, and what was the cause of what they saw as well. There's two parts, and you got to maybe find out what the cause was, and go on and on. But at any rate, um, there was clearly looks like there was some color coding going on. Redlining on the Federal Housing Authority. FHA manual that explicitly laid out segregationist policies. Okay, on the FHA manual that explicitly laid out the segregationist policies. It was in something that it was in something called the underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration, which said that incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. And this is really during these times, just gives me appreciation for what individuals had to go through just because of those times. And it always reminds me, based upon where I am today, especially in the same geographical location, to at least for my own sake and for my internal appreciation, to walk with the highest of standards as an individual for what people had to go through that was beyond their control and really may not have been, I could be wrong, engaged in civics like the information age is today. So colognes could not be insured. In one development in Detroit, the FHA would not go ahead during World War II with this development unless the developer built a 6-foot high wall, cement wall, separating his development from a nearby African American neighborhood to make sure that no African Americans could even walk into that neighborhood. So, what comes to my mind as I read this information is it happened. I don't say this lightly. And at the same time, I can't be naive to know that in the past, one's color of their skin affected, probably what I guess what I'm reading, color of skin affected your livelihood, your lifestyle. And that's the past. And looking at it from the future, and the modern perspective, um, you can even walk into that neighborhood. It's heavy. And so people, can feel a certain way and say, oh, this is how it's always been. And this is what their information they're receiving. So again, you have to have the dialogue. You have to say, did this happen? Did it not happen? If it did happen, recognize it happened and say in good faith, what are you doing to move it forward? In your valuable way. In your valuable way. If not, it's perceived. And another question because now you get into again segregation and is that something desegregation, integration, you know, um, you get into all of those layers. I have my perspectives, but everybody has theirs. And, there has to be a point, and that's a tricky subject, of unity. Is there a point of unity? Thinking out loud here. The underwriting manual of the Federal Housing Administration recommended that highways be a good way to separate African Americans from white neighborhoods. So this was not a matter of law, it was a matter of government regulation. But it also wasn't hidden. So it can't be claimed that this was some kind of de facto situation. Regulations that are written in law and published in the underwriting manual are as much a de jure unconstitutional expression of government policy as something written in law. And I do want to advocate literacy. Young children, if you're watching, it's very important to read because a lot of information that's going to help stimulate your mind and grow is going to be in books. It's going to be online, and you want to be able to read and be a decent reader to grow your mind because the more information you get, the more your mind can form and manifest. And that's another conversation situations. But you can only do that through exposure of information, and that comes through words, which are symbols. So, or letters. Words come from words, which come from letters, which pretty much are symbols, if you will. On the long-term effects of African Americans being prohibited from buying homes in suburbs and building equity. On the long-term effects of African Americans being prohibited from buying homes in suburbs and building equity. Today, African American home incomes, sorry, today African American incomes on average are about 60% of average white incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. Most middle class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So, this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. Boy, 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 we're going to highlight that one. And the long term effects of African Americans being prohibited from buying homes in suburbs and building equity. The federal government. So, this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. Give me your thoughts on that. Give me your insight. The dialogue has to happen, and we have to use emotional intelligence to have the conversation for movement to go forward as a unit. That's the whole point of this. It's not to point fingers, but how do we move together as a unit to have a conversation to address the challenge with solutions and move forward as a unit. And sometimes it's okay for units to be separated or the units to be together because it's still a unit. So, entirely attributable to the federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. Thoughts on that, please? African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, there's your answer, and even to the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration. And I do want to say, keep in mind that supposedly the conversation is that individuals within political parties swapped and went to, became the opposite party, things of that nature. So I don't want to just kind of all the way throw out, political parties because they've been mixed in from my understanding. So the 1940s, 50s, and even the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. So, the Daly City development south of San Francisco or Levittown or any of the others in between across the country, those homes in the late 1940s and 50s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. I believe the VA is Veteran Affairs mortgage, so military. African Americans were equally able to afford their homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 or $400,000 at minimum, 8 times national median income. So in the 1960s, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in Daly City or Levittown, but it's an empty promise because those homes are no longer affordable to the families that could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and the wealth that followed from that. The white families sent their children to college with their home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They're able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrue to African Americans, who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs. So, I'm an advocate of Rich Dad Poor Dad. Robert Kiyosaki says that a house is a liability based upon it just being something that's a living occupancy. Um, but it looks like the home equities for families can really set you up, not only your parents, but also your children and yourself. So, the home equity, if you have a home, which Robert Kiyosaki says is a liability, if it's an asset in that regard, is what they're saying in this paragraph. If you are, if you are eligible to get a home, or you may maybe thinking about getting a home, or you don't want to find out what do I have to do to qualify to start getting a home. Let's see if we can leave a link in here. But it's saying here, according to the document, that families sent their children to college with their home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. So that's how you can take advantage of home buying, and looked like maybe it was in the suburbs. But on how housing projects went from being for white middle and lower middle class families to being predominantly black and poor. It's a great read as far as mind stimulation goes. Public housing began in this country for civilians during the New Deal, and it was an attempt to address a housing shortage. Again, it boils down to the money. Housing shortage. Well, how does our money got to do with housing shortage? Another conversation, but it does tie in. It wasn't a welfare program for the poor. Public housing began in this country for civilians during the New Deal, and it was an attempt to address a housing shortage. It wasn't a welfare program for the poor. During the Depression, no housing construction was going on. There it is. No housing construction was going on. Middle class families, working class families were losing their homes during the Depression when they became unemployed. And so there were many unemployed middle class, working class, white families. And this was the constituency that the federal government was most interested in. Powerful statement. Unemployed, and so there were so many unemployed middle class, working class, white families, and this was the constituency that the federal government was most interested in. And so the federal government began a program of building public housing for whites only in cities across the country. The liberal instinct of some Roosevelt administration officials led them to build some projects for African Americans as well, but they were always separate projects. They were not integrated. It's powerful how the segregation was, segregation was there according to this document. So again, comment, jump in. You read this to know, what it is, but you don't walk in um like, oh, because at the end of the day, things have moved forward. It's to a point to where at this point, if you're looking at it from 40 to 50 years ago in the past and saying, okay, well, there were some things within control of the African American community and things that were out of the control of the African American community. We saw this 50, 60 years ago. We now should have a blueprint or a mathematical equation on how to get a new output. We have a new process to get the new output, because you should be able to look right here and see the challenges and shortcomings to be able to provide solutions, um, and for any ethnicity, if you will. So the white projects had a large number of vacancies. Black projects had long waiting lists. So it sounds like as there were middle class families, working class families, and they want to say so middle class, working class white families. I'm sure there were also middle class, working class, if you will, black families, and there were also, of course. So first of all, unemployed middle class or lower middle class. So what happens if you were like low class of any color? What happened there? What did that look like? But apparently, looking at the numbers of 60% income, 5% of the wealth, that if the middle class, lower middle class, white family, if you will, were having challenges, we know the African American families were having challenges. So I can see where there was a long waiting list because either there were no jobs or the money, that little money that was coming in, wasn't circulated in a way that could support these neighborhoods and communities. Maybe it could have been within or without their control. I'm not sure. Out of their control. Eventually, it became so conspicuous. Shoot, conspicuous, conspicuous. Oh Lord. Hey, eventually became so conspicuous. Wow, that the public housing authorities and the federal government opened up white designated projects to African Americans, and they filled with African Americans. At the same time, industry was leaving cities. African Americans were becoming poorer in those areas. The projects were becoming projects for poor people, not for working class people. They became subsidized. They hadn't been subsidized before. And so they became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing. And that's so interesting. So what I'm hearing is during the Depression, there were jobs being lost. And so now you had working middle class, lower middle class families, in this article saying white families that really had, it sounds like there was shortage of housing, like there was enough actual houses, is what it sounds like. So they built these public housing sites, but in the building, keep in mind, that's construction, that's jobs. That creates construction jobs. And what I've been taught for some of my wealthier clients is, for every one job that's produced, that one job creates seven other jobs because now that one person is going to be able to take their money and spend it with their local businesses. The idea is local. You may go um, beyond local, non-local, but the idea is with that one job, that money could be circulated to produce seven other jobs. So the bottom line is when you're creating public housing sites, that creates jobs, that creates kind of skilled trade. So you're doing plumbing, electrical, you're doing management, you're doing cement, you're doing everything. That creates jobs for everybody. You got local retail and businesses now. People are able to deposit checks. They're able to go to the local bread store. The local food across the street from the construction is making money. Um, People are now going to school to learn how to do the skilled jobs because there's going to be more growth for the next 10, 20 years or whatever have you. There was jobs being created through building public housing sites and then even creating interstates. That's jobs. So you got to figure the New Deal, if I'm a understand this correctly, was an opportunity to build jobs. It still boils down to the money though. It was an opportunity to build jobs, but it sounds like from this content that it was an opportunity to build jobs for what they're saying white families. And the black and color families were secondary. That's what that's saying is what I'm getting from it. With that being said, easier said than done, and right or wrong, sometimes you got to get in where you fit in. So if you know that these are the only jobs that they're hiring for, then you need to get that. I hate to say it, but you got to get that job and you got to work it to the highest of standards to get promoted to the highest of that level and then make your money work for you if you wanted to do it for the community that you are residing in, the neighborhoods you're residing in. Because the thing is, in a capitalistic society, if you're not making any money, be it self-employed or employed by somebody else, you're not going to be able to survive and do what needs to be done to develop the next generation. In biology, it's survival one, reproduction two, and that's it. So how can you survive and then reproduce when in a capitalistic society you're not making legal money? You know what I mean? So if they're saying we're going to create these jobs through housing construction and infrastructure development, and they just got all they have is the sweeping jobs or the jobs where you clean up the trash um, from what they're demolishing, then you got to get it. And yeah, you're living in a rougher home, and everybody's pretty much um, hanging on by a thread. But if there's a strong household and a strong neighborhood, guess what? You guys are providing for the children who at that time will be in a better position spiritually, intellectually, and physically and skill wise to do what they're supposed to do for their generation of kids, and it goes on to the next generation. So even though you may seem like, dang, I got this job and I'm picking up the trash from the skilled demolition men that I could be getting a job for, but I guess because of the color of my skin, I can't. You do have a right to be mad and be all into that, but at the same time, you're still creating that foundation to lift up to say, I'm bigger than that. You're not gonna hold me. It doesn't matter. I'm gonna do what I gotta do, and the little 2 pennies that I have for myself, I'm gonna try to invest into a business or whatever. Those are the things that at the end of the day, you have to do in order for the true growth, and also in some cultures for them to people to respect you. Like, dang, we just kicked them all the way while he or she was down, and they still found a way. That's true. That's true perseverance. And some people just are just hardwired for perseverance or respect perseverance in a way. Um, so it sounds like that's what's going on from what I can read. The New Deal was about creating construction. I haven't even looked into the research yet, but just what I can read in the article, the New Deal was creating construction and infrastructure jobs. And it looks like the black African Americans, African Americans Um, we're getting the short end of the stick. So um, they became vertical slums. It's a powerful statement, though. So now let's get this. Let's get this. Let's get this. Let me grasp this now. So now you create from the New Deal. You got construction jobs going on in the urban, in the I'm assuming in the urban areas. You got infrastructure development going on in the urban areas. But then you have the suburbs, which is also developing housing and commercial, but it's away from the core infrastructure or urban area where, from what I can understand, usually has the highest crime, stress, uh, um, rough lifestyle based upon the lifestyle and the capitalism, financial management that goes with that compared to residing out of that immediate, highly residential area into more of a suburb. We're going to have to break that word down in a minute. Suburb area where you're able to, I don't want to say poop where you pee, poop where you eat, but you there's a separation there. I'm gonna just say that because we're just talking. But this is what I'm getting from it. So where was I going with that? And became products for the poor. Yeah. So where I was going with that was, so now the people ended up moving into the suburbs, and they're making money from the development of the urban core, but also making money from the development of the suburbs. And now African Americans and people of color have housing. But how do you get housing? You go from, now there's a waiting list, but you have housing now. How do you go into slums? Like, where does that word, and how do we get there? So they became, just because they became subsidized, and just because they were poor people, they become vertical slums. How do you get there? How do you get there? It's another conversation. Leave your comments. Be respectful. Be professional of how you get there. Just because there's migration, and then you're left with people that have housing, but now they're slums. Let's look at the word slum, so y'all know the magnitude of that word. Because you went from explaining something to like they're slums, a squalid and overcrowded urban street or district inhabited by very poor people. So I guess they're saying slums as in, I'm gonna pull it up, slums economically. But I don't know. I mean, does that mean that the crime was high, and does that mean that the was the neighborhoods clean? I don't know. I'm about to look into that. That's what I thought of slums. Just a really bad physical and economical, cultural challenge. The vacancies in the white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize America, and the Federal Housing Administration subsidized mass production builders to create subdivisions that were white only, and they subsidized the families who were living in the white housing projects, as well as whites who were living elsewhere in the central city, to move out of the central cities and into these white only suburbs. So it sounds like, let me keep reading. So it was the Federal Housing Administration that depopulated public housing of white families, while the public housing authorities were charged with the responsibility of housing African Americans who were increasingly too poor to pay the full cost of their rent. Powerful. And I don't know whether to feel a certain way in regards to motivation to say, well, I'm going to show the social economic in a professional way, look at the word professional, but that whatever that was, and whatever, and again, you have to have appreciation for this history, really of any color. But I know that if based upon my skin color, that I may have had a hard time. I don't know, because I don't know. I've heard people say it wasn't, especially those that are older, and everybody has a perspective. That's the whole unique thing about it. You have to honor everyone's perspective. Because the moment you dishonor someone's perspective, the moment you're telling them that what they think and feel doesn't matter, what they believe, what they um, what fuels them. So it's tough because when you honor is everything, respect is everything in certain situations. So so basically, excuse me, the vacancies and the white projects were created primarily by the Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize America. So it was a priority to suburbanize America. I broke this word down. Sub means like under or below or beneath, undetected, if you will. And within this word, you also have the word urban. So everything, especially being a urban core development um, community relations expert for these developers, as far as connecting them with the communities, urban was where it was at, is what it sounds like from reading this. Urbanized, core inside was where it was at. It got to a point where um, I guess jobs were lost through housing shortages. So they could say it was housing shortages. Maybe it wasn't. It was just a way to create jobs, bottom line. We're going to, and the government played a role by helping to pay for that. So it wasn't like the corporations all got together and say, or individually say, hey, we're going to put our private dollars together. They were incentivized by their government to say, hey, build these houses, but we're going to pay you, but they have to be for white only. Now, I'm not sure if that's what the government actually said, and if so, again, it goes back to why. But at the same time, if that's the case, how do you ensure that even though there's segregation, you still represent your neighborhood to the highest light of like, was there challenges within control and without control that made the African American neighborhoods uh, depleted or um, devalued over time? So, at any rate, let me know your thoughts on this. It was just to me something good to talk about. Leave your thoughts, your comments. Let's get into what other conversations can you see us getting into from this article. And if you have any supporting articles for or documents, for your perspective in your case, please bring this information, as this information is public information. I was just going through my day to day, and I said, you know what? Let me go ahead and do a video about this. Let's do a recording. Let's have a conversation. Let's stimulate minds. I'm not advocating or NPR, and at this point or anything is advocating or working together. There's no civic or political. It's just something being a urban core development community relations specialist and expert. I work with the corporate world. I work with wealthy millionaires and billionaires that put their money in real estate. And my firm is contracted to serve as a liaison with community residents that are truly affected, by the investment dollars of these industry professionals. And a lot of times, because the money needs to be made and should be made, it's very important for that sector to hold itself blameless. And so my firm has the opportunity as best it can to help serve as an advisor to these private sector industry leaders on how best to transform the community in a way that's beneficial for the everyday individual that does not have the same perspective and mindset and even cares, if you will, of someone in an investor's position, being someone that's employed, working for somebody. Those are two different mindsets from an economic and really social economic perspective. And so our firm has the great opportunity to be able to help bridge that gap. And through that, my role in government relations, dealing with urban core development through both advising as well as education for the community has grown. So I felt like this was a really great article to talk about. So look forward to joining you next time, and thank you for leaving your comments, and leave some comments on what topics to talk about next that complement what we have here. Take it easy, and see you at the top.